Thank you guys all for coming out at 8 a.m. after a drink up. I appreciate that. It's more than I was expecting here today. So how many people are doing code reviews of some kind in your company right now? Nearly everybody. That's great. So the first time I gave this talk was a few months ago, and on the placard outside the door and everywhere else, they had spelled the name of my talk incorrectly, which led to some humor, and I ended up changing the slides a little bit based on that. But today we're going to be doing the poetry edition, which means there's going to be every other slide is going to be poetry for your benefit that you can read, and hopefully it illustrates a little bit of the points that I'm trying to make. So first thing we're going to talk about is what is a code review. So we've got a lot of different ways that we can do code review, right? So the first way, sort of, and this isn't what I would consider actually a code review, is when you've got a program looking at your code, right? So this could be something like PHP Code Sniffer or Project Mess Detection, all these automated tools, linters, things like that. But that's not really code review. There's only so much they can tell you. They're completely based on rules, right? So you have your code is not indented correctly or whatever else. Computers are very good for that, and I recommend that you do use those pieces of software for that purpose, but that's not really a code review. So what a code review really is when you are looking at someone else's code, right? And that's the code review, right? We want to look at somebody else's code, have somebody else looking at our code as we build it up. So both directions, legitimate code review, and we want to get feedback on our code. If we're just looking at the code and not getting feedback, there's no point, there's no purpose, right? So there's a lot of common ways that we can do code reviews, and I'm going to go over those ways and tell you why they don't work. And then I'm going to tell you another thing that does work, and we'll go through that, and I'll give more examples on that one. So the first way, and I'm gonna have raising hands or whatever, maybe everybody stand up or something so we wake up in the morning because I didn't bring pots of coffee for everybody to chug when we start, is emailing code or diffs to each other. Has anybody done this as a method of code review? A couple people. So how well did it work? Not very well. So this is a not recommended way of doing things. It's better than not doing code review, but it's not a very good way to do it. And essentially this means you're creating a code diff, or you're emailing the entire new file to somebody, and you send it through email, and then you hope that somebody is going to reply back and give you some feedback on what you're doing, right? So you've got to know the list of people that want to review your code, or the people that are not likely to throw your code away and not give you any feedback. So you send the code, and what happens? They write back. You're like, oh, this is amazing. I got a reply. I got somebody telling me what they think about my code. Oh, man. And typically it's going to be something like this, right? A lot of us, our code is our baby. We feel very, very bad if somebody says, what you just spent some time on is no good. So that's not a good feeling, right? And in email, we have to remember that pretty much the worst way that you can possibly take written word is the worst way that it's going to be taken, right? The most negative possible way, right? You don't get all the subtleties of facial expressions and gestures, and you can't necessarily tell sarcasm via email. But so they reply back, right? Or maybe they didn't. So you're waiting to hear. You're like, I really need your code review before I can get back to doing my next thing, right? Sometimes that response never appears. The other problem that can happen is that they just completely ignore you, right? So you send out this code review, you spend all of the time building a diff up or sending the attachments, however you end up doing it, and you get nothing back, right? You're expecting something, nothing occurred. Oh, and I already said this part, so there we go. And here's what typically will go through someone's mind if you send this code review out and you get back this response, right? So what we've got here is essentially, this is completely made up, obviously, but this could be a response that somebody receives back from their code review, right? And here's what you're thinking when you're reading it, or here's what they're thinking, right? So they may not understand all of the things that you're telling them, right? We use lots of TLAs in programming, right? 3-letter acronyms, right? They don't necessarily know what you're talking about, and they're going to start thinking, okay, why is this guy picking on me? What is wrong with this? Why is he such a jerk, right? And so reading through this thing, people tend to get more and more defensive, and the reviewer who sent out this diff is going to get, they're going to like basically shut down, right? When you get defensive, you shut down, you stop listening, you're not interested in what people have to say for you. And so rather than start a big fight, they just ignore it, right? Oh no. All right. So another way to do code reviews is evaluate the diff in the repo, right? So essentially they're checking in the code, and then after the fact you go in and you take a look and you see whatever they've done. I've done this before in Subversion, where, other than patches, that's about the only way that you can do stuff. But there's a lot better things out there than Subversion that work a lot better for code reviews and things like that. So actually, let me ask one more question. How many people are using source control of some kind? I think everybody? All right, that's awesome. I'm very happy about that. So evaluating the the diff in a repo. This is usually done by one person, and usually it's one very particular person, and I'll get to that in a moment. It requires, in order for the reviews to work, a lot of diligence, right? Because if you're not reviewing your own code, so let's say there's one person, right, reviewing their code, okay? Probably nobody's reviewing their code because nobody else knows enough to do anything about it. But as they go through, they've got to make sure that they're checking everybody's code. And so the bigger the team, the more of a pain that becomes. There's a lot more work that you've got to do as the individual reviewer that you wouldn't have to do otherwise. So what happens when this reviewer finds a problem? Well, they send the review out, usually as an email, like, hey, look at this code on this line. You should do this thing. It's a pain. I did this for years. It's awful. And it has a lot of the same problems we already talked about, right? Everything is taken in the most negative way possible. People aren't very responsive to email a lot of times. How many people need more email, right? I actually thought I did a long time ago when I got my first college email address and nothing was in there, right? And then now I'm at, 75,000 emails in one box and 200 and something odd in Gmail, because guess what? We don't have to delete things anymore, and almost all of those are unread because I don't need more email. So the other problem is, again, it's a very large burden on that single developer. And the other thing is, usually this developer is the most senior person on your team. They're the person that should be writing a lot of the code, but they're not, because they're spending all this time reviewing code and sending back emails where they're having to copy paste file paths and line numbers and remember all this stuff. It's completely horrible. So the next way that does not work is doing a group review in a conference room. Okay? How many people have done this, right? So I am not a fan of meetings pretty much at all. If they've got a good purpose, and if we've got an agenda, we've got something that's specific that we're going to accomplish, fine, I'll go ahead and have them. But I'm not one of the people that likes meetings for the sake of meetings. I think meetings are a great way for people to eat donuts and get nothing done. So we gather everybody around a projector, we gather them all around a TV, and somebody shows the code, and people make comments on the code, right? So this takes a lot of time. It's not a lot of fun, and again, it's not very effective. Okay, that barely shows up on my screen over here, and it's showing up okay over there. The other problem is we've got all the developers in a room staring at a screen, and we've got one developer's code who's under review. So similar to the email problem, that developer can feel like they're being attacked. Everybody is criticizing all the things they did, and it's a huge group of people criticizing all of the things that they did. So what do we do about that? Well, we have a moderator. right? We have somebody in there whose job is to make sure that we stay kind of focused and stay concentrated on the code rather than on attacking the developer. We make sure that it doesn't get to the point where it's attacking the developer. Now we have not all of the problems of email, right? Because you're in the same room, you can detect things like sarcasm, which I would say is not necessarily a great tool when you're doing code reviews because it doesn't always come off as sarcasm or as people having fun. But that would depend on your team and everything like that. So the job of a moderator is pretty difficult, all right? So they've got to make sure we're staying on topic, we're getting our things done and everything else. The other thing is, as the developer is sitting there taking all of these barbs and bullets about their little baby that people are calling ugly, they're not necessarily taking note of all of the things that are wrong or need to be changed. And so you've also got to have another role in there, which is the note taker. And the note taker's job is basically record all of the feedback. So at the end of the meeting, they can give it to the developer and the developer can go back and figure out how they're going to resolve all of the issues that have come up during that time. So when we're doing this, it's often going to take up the entire team, right? We've got everybody on the team is going to be dragged in, otherwise it's not very effective either. Now, one more thing wrong with the group code review is that we can't always do that. Sometimes the changes are just too big. Sometimes we need to move faster than we can, and so scheduling time every time we need to do a check-in or a code commit or pushing up code isn't necessarily possible, right? There's just too many changes going on. The bigger your team, the more of those things there are. And so you could spend literally days sitting in a room, looking at code, telling people what you think about them, and everybody cries, and it's not fun. So there's yet another way here that we're going to talk about that doesn't work as well, and that is the over-shoulder code review, right? This is where a developer says, hey, can you come over here and take a look at this and let me know what you think, right? So you go over to their desk and you take a look at their code, and they're kind of in control driving with the mouse and they're showing you what they want to look at. So the problem with this, though, is that the person who wrote the code is in control of what you're seeing, right? They can jump around to the places that they think might need some work, when in reality, the problem may be somewhere else, right? I've had one person contact me through email who wanted me to tell them, why is my Zen Framework app running really slow and taking up a lot of memory? And I said, well, let me take a look at your code. He's like, no, 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 no. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put together a PowerPoint deck of certain areas of the code, and then we're going to meet in a Starbucks, and you can tell me why the problem exists. I'm like, well, I can tell you right now, this is, and I gave him a couple of reasons why it might be going slow. But I'm like, that's going to be completely ineffective, right? If you think you know where the problem is, then fix it. But likely, based on the fact that he was contacting me, he had no idea what the problem was. And that would give, if he is controlling what I see out of his code, it's not likely going to be very effective in figuring out whatever the problem was going to be. So with this over-the-shoulder code review, the problem is the reviewer's just along for the ride. You're staring at the code as the guy scrolls through, clicks, does whatever he needs to do to get through there, and you have, other than interrupting and saying, you know what, we need to go back or click on this or go through, which is also a very frustrating way to use the computer, right? Like standing behind somebody, you should type this right now, you should click here right now and do all that. It's awful. So the developer leads the reviewer for their code, and you don't have very much chance to see what you really need to review. So they interrupt the reviewer. They're like, wait, let's go back. Let's take a look. So this is not the worst thing in the world. Again, code review is better than no code review, right? But what if you need to do it again? You need more than one reviewer, right? Typically, you want to have more than one reviewer because some person may not be familiar with the code or the area of code. And so we've got to do it again, right? So this means more time is lost on the developer's point, right? Because they've got to sit there with somebody behind them over and over. Found this quote. I thought it was a good one. Now, how many people use GitHub? Do you use it for your company or do you use it for open source? Company? So you're probably familiar with this, right? If you're doing, are you doing pull requests with GitHub? So if you're using GitHub for either open source or for your company, GitHub provides a way for you to do pull request code review, right? When you do a pull request, you can sit there and you can click on a line and you can comment about the line and give a couple of bits of feedback or whatever else. And you'll see this all the time in open source projects. You'll see a pull request come in, somebody will click on it, and they will, they'll say, hey, what about this, or fix this, or this isn't up to our coding standards, whatever it may be. So this is getting better. We're actually getting to the things that are potential to work or work well. Now, GitHub is not intended as a code review tool, right? It's a repository. You're putting your code in there, you're sharing, you're forking, you're doing pull request, all that. They have reviews, but its main purpose isn't reviews. So at this point, the poetry is done, and we're going to talk more about the things that work with this. First off, the problem with this one is you have to have this pull request process, right? You have to be able to have a way where you can say, hey, I've got a bit of code that I want pulled in so everybody else can see it, right? So this works really well with Git Mercurial, right? With GitHub, Bitbucket, those kinds of things, or your internal tools. This doesn't work very well with Subversion or CVS. We don't really have the concept of pull request with Subversion or CVS because you don't, I mean, who does branches in those, right? You do branches when you're going to do a release, but you don't go and work in a branch. You don't have anything separated. And when it all comes back together, now you've got merge hell that you need to deal with, right? So how about it? I'm going to ask another one. How many people are using a distributed version control system like Git or Mercurial? How many are stuck on CVS or Subversion? You trying to get off of there? Good. Perforce? There's a bunch of others. There's ClearCase, there's Star Team. Sorry. All right, so we have a lot of different code review tools, and they can vary quite a bit. So what does work is when you get a formal code review process with software that is specifically designed for code review. It's designed to allow you to easily get your code into the repository or into the review software and review the changes. That's the whole entire point. That's what they focus on. They're not worried about how do I make this work fast as a repository? How can I support code, pull requests and everything else? The greatest thing about this is that they don't interrupt development. You do the code review at a point when you're done developing and you need to help your coworkers out by doing their code review. You don't have to have somebody come over your shoulder and look at it. You don't have to pull somebody out of whatever they're doing. And you certainly don't have to have these big, long, stupid meetings with everybody in the room yelling at you. Another feature that's very important is that it allows you to comment on lines or groups of lines, right? GitHub has a feature where you can basically comment on a single line. Well, that's good. It's not as good as being able to say, this entire block of code is what I'm talking about, and this is what you need to take a look at and what you need to consider potentially refactoring, rewriting, or changing in some way. They also allow you to make comments on the entire review as a whole, right? So you may have opened quite a few comments in the code, but you want to let the reviewer know, hey, I don't actually hate you. I think this is pretty good. We just need to kind of focus on this sort of theme of changes or problems. They also allow for that developer who posted the review to reply back to the comments that you made, right? And this is another very important thing because it tracks that conversation that you're having, right? So you open an issue or you say, hey, here's a problem with the code, and they write back and say, well, this is why I did it, right? And sometimes code review is just for that. Why did you do it this way? Or I don't understand. And it may be an opportunity for you to say, look, maybe you should comment it, or it may be something that you just learn about, right? They also allow you to give an overall review status, right? So this is essentially like, I approve or I don't approve of this code, ship it, that kind of things. And they allow you to open issues, right? So issues are things where this is more than just a comment. This is a critical problem that we need to fix before we want to move forward with this code, okay? In the software that we use at my work, we have a concept of a ship it. And all a ship it is a checkbox that when the reviewer is done going through the code and they think it's good enough to go to production, they click the little box and it says ship it. Now you can still have issues on the code, right? Things that have to be fixed, but you're like, hey, if you fix these couple of things, I'm good with this going up, right? You also have the option of doing a review without a ship it, which is, there's more than a few things on here that need to be changed, and you need to work on those, and then we're going to re-review, right? Speaking of re-review, another important feature is allowing you to update your diffs, right? We don't want to have to reopen a new, or open a new review every time you've got a new change, right? If you've gone back and you've made feedback changes on your code, having that in the context of what you've already done is very, very helpful, right? Some code review tools allow you to diff the diffs and see what was the difference between what they originally posted and what they have now, so you can see that they actually did make the changes that you suggested, or if they ignored whatever you did. Now, if you've got, sometimes with distributed version control like Git and Mercurial, you have a way to build your code based on someone else's code, right? Someone else's code that's not yet in the repository that you're comparing with, right? And so another good feature is allowing you to do diffs with parent diffs. What a parent diff does is it allows you to see what is the difference between what's in our repository or our central repository, whatever, you know, however you set up your version control, and what did they do, right? So what did they do, not what did Joe do that you built on top of. And so you can upload potentially two diffs, one telling you how do I get from the repository to the point that I care about, and then how do I get from the point that I care about to the end of the changes that we're actually reviewing. Another great feature would be to allow for multiple version control systems. At my work, we still have Subversion repositories, but we also use Mercurial. So our code review tool allows us to do code reviews on Mercurial and Subversion and Git and CVS. Something else that could be very helpful in your process is if your code review tool has an API. Ours has an API, and we've been able to integrate that into a couple of different tools. So we have a process where QA controls the flow of code into QA. So developers build a bunch of code, they put it into review board, it gets reviewed, they get their ship-its, and then they let QA know through Jira that the code is ready, and then QA can pick and choose and say, I want this or I want that or whatever, and they tell the integrator tool to go ahead and pull those things in and deploy it to QA. And we use the API in the code review tool so QA can see, does this code have the required number of ship-its and reviews, and are all the issues closed out or taken care of? So that way, if it's not, QA can say, nope, this is not ready. Despite you telling me it's ready, you still have review issues that you need to deal with. So that's nice. Code review tools are available installed locally. You can also get them hosted. And depending on your situation is how you would pick which one you want to do there. One thing that's very important when you're starting to implement a formal code review process is that you need to get buy-in. You need to get buy-in from your devs, and you need to get buy-in from your management. This is adding time to your process. In my opinion, it's very valuable time. Code review is very, very important, but it does take time. And so you need to make sure that everybody's aware this is going to take a little bit of your time, but it's going to be worth it in the end. We're going to have fewer hot fixes after we deploy our software to production. We're going to have a better trained team. They're going to learn from doing this, and that's a good thing. And then you decide how to integrate it in your process. So I talked a little bit about our process, but your process may be completely different. You know, our process, we have a repository that's called Golden. That is, no code gets in there that hasn't gone through everything else, right? And we have an integrator repository, which allows QA to pull in their code, merge it in, or it gets merged in automatically and deployed up to QA. They have the option at that point to reject the code entirely, which means that we blow away that integrator repository and rebuild it based on Golden, and then pull back in the things that did not get rejected, right? This gives you quite a bit of flexibility, and it means that the things that are in Golden, and Golden is the one that goes to production or eventually will go to production, have been through development review checking, they've been through testing, they've been through the automated builds and things like that, running unit tests, they've been through peer dev review, they've been through the code review, they've been through the integration process and a formal QA process as well before they can ever get there. QA has the only power to move things along to Golden. Another thing you need to decide on your process is how many reviews, right? If you've only got 3 people, getting 2 reviews on everything may be a little bit difficult. If you've only got 2 people getting 2 reviews on it, is going to be very, very difficult because you don't necessarily want to review your own code, right? So this is something that may change based on team or situation or whatever, and it's something that you need to decide on your process how it's going to work. I went over the concept of ship-its earlier, and you need to decide how many ship-its are okay. For ours, every team has to provide 2 ship-its, and you have to have your issues closed out or resolved, right? Otherwise, the code doesn't move forward. Okay, so at least 2 other people would need to say that this is good enough. Now, I have one team that I'm on that has only 3 people. We don't have this in place yet, but we would essentially say, okay, or let's say another team. We have one team that has only 2 UI guys. They're working in EXT, they're doing all this stuff that nobody else really understands what's going on. So for that, we require we require the ship it from the other UI guy, if it's UI code, plus a ship it from anybody else, but you have to have that one ship it from a particular person. And so this is a process that you can have in place in order to make sure that things make sense and that you're not holding up the works too bad. You need to find out if there's any other requirements or restrictions. Like I said, we make sure that all of our issues are closed out or dropped, right? And with our software, we have ability to say, no, this isn't actually an issue and drop it. This is the rules that we put in place or whatever say you can't drop it without a discussion of the developer who opened it. But if they decide that, okay, this isn't an issue, maybe I just didn't understand why you did it this way, then you're allowed to drop it. Otherwise, if you fix it or change it according to what the developer who reviewed your code has requested, then you can mark it as fixed, and it allows you to do both of those things. You need to have a time frame to complete this review. So this is how long from when the review is posted should you have reviews coming in, right? Everybody's busy, they're all doing work, they're all doing development, but the reviewing is a very important part of our process, right? And so we don't want somebody that just sits there and cranks out code and doesn't look at anybody else's code. And so our rule of thumb, since we require 2 ship-its, is every time you post a review, or every time, when you finish a chunk of code and you post a review, you should go back in and do 2 reviews of other people's code, right? If you need 2 reviews on your code, providing 2 reviews means that we're basically staying neutral, right? And how you work it on your team is up to you and your process, but that's what we do. So now we've given feedback, right? We said, okay, within 24 hours of a review being posted, people need to be reviewing this code, right? Which leads to, as you're working, you need to get into the repository and make sure that you're keeping up with your reviews. Now, once you've done that, you need to make sure that you've got a time frame for responses. This is a response from the original developer back to the issues or comments that the reviewers have made. And this is important as well, because now the developer is waiting again, the reviewers have spent the time to do this review, right? And you need to make sure that your developer who originally posted it is taking the time to read and respond to the feedback. It's very important that you make sure that there's no personal attacks that happen in there. As I said before, text feedback will be taken in the most negative possible way ever. That's just how it is. There's tools on email that'll tell you chili peppers or something about how potentially inflammatory this email may be viewed as. Same thing happens with code reviews. So we got to make sure that there's no personal attacks, that the reviews are all about the code, and that if there's additional things that need to be discussed, maybe you need to get up and go talk to them in person instead of writing, why are you calling me lazy? What is this, what's going on here? So in the reviews, we have constructive criticism, and it's only constructive criticism. This is very important as well. Our review tool is used to help build up the team, not tear the team down or not tear down an individual developer. We're trying to make everybody better. We want to avoid the long ongoing conversations. A lot of times we'll see a thread go on for a while where developers discuss back and forth why something was done or why something wasn't done. And that's not very productive either, right? And those long ongoing conversations do tend to move towards the personal attack kind of thing, or at least where people are feeling that that's what's going on. So we recommend that people get up, go over to the person's desk. If they're remote, talk to them on Skype or video or something. Google Hangouts work well for that. And we keep the review about the code. One thing that we've implemented to a certain extent as well is things about what can be considered issues, right? So things that we consider to be issues would be, you missed your code sniffer thing, right? This is not a great one because we can write tools, or we have tools. We have PHP Code Sniffer that can tell us that stuff anyway. But it becomes pretty clear to people that are familiar with the coding standard that somebody's missed that, and so those can be considered issues. If there's clear bugs or logic issues or things that may cause problems to our software when we launch it, those can be issues as well. We try and make it so it's, to the most part, opinions about code shouldn't be issues. In some cases they can be if you feel strongly enough about it. But going back to a couple slides ago, we don't want to make these long, huge conversations going through about, this is why I opened it up, and, well, I don't agree with that. Well, too bad, I'm going to keep it open, you can't drop it, and so on. So there's quite a few benefits of implementing this process, right? First of which is better code. If you've got more people looking at your code, the better it's going to be. Open source is awesome because you've got thousands and thousands of eyes looking at this code and finding issues and fixes and doing pull requests and everything else. Quite a few bugs can be caught before launching your code or before QA testing. This is great. I want my QA team to be able to look at, or to pull in a piece of code, and the only thing that they're able to find is when they're doing really weird stuff that developers didn't even think of doing, right? I don't want them to be able to click a button and go, oh yeah, you know what, pagination doesn't work again, or if I reload twice, the screen is black, right? We need to find those things before they get to QA, so QA can spend their time finding the really weird things that are tough to automate. Code review is a great learning opportunity, right? You've got people from all different levels of development in your team, from senior on down, and everybody can learn from everybody, right? The senior developer doesn't necessarily know everything. They may not have some of the other language experience that some of the more junior people have. And the junior people don't know as much about the product or possibly the language as some of the senior guys. And so having this review allows knowledge sharing and transfer of knowledge from developer to developer. And so it makes your entire team better. Apparently I skipped ahead on that one. But having more eyes on it is always a good thing, right? So some of the software that's out there, we've got ReviewBoard. This is the software that we use at my company. It's a Python-based install, and I've got a few screenshots of ReviewBoard. If you're working with Jira as a bug tracker, Atlassian has a software product called Crucible. There's one called Code Collaborator, which I believe is rather expensive, but I've also heard is quite good. Fabricator is a free one from PHP. I have not used it personally. It looks interesting. If you go and find their webpage, you can't quite tell if they're joking about things or not. It's a little bit odd. Kiln is a software product from Fog Creek Software, so Jolan Software, and it integrates with the repository. Kiln is actually the name of their repository as well. The cool thing with that, and I'll give them a little bit of a plug even though we don't use them, but it's neat, is their repositories work with both Git and Mercurial. It doesn't matter what they originated as. You can have the exact same repository. You can use Git tools to mess with it. You can use Mercurial tools to mess with it. It does that translation on the back end for you, which is pretty awesome. So this next screen here is a screenshot of ReviewBoard, and it's basically the dashboard. So when you go into ReviewBoard, you'll see, based on whatever teams you're assigned to, some of the reviews that are available. It's customizable, so you can get different columns and things, but essentially you've got, over here is the summary. This is what the developer wrote in as what this review is about. You've got, here's the submitter, the developer who wrote the code. You've got when was it posted and when was it updated, and it gets color-coded based on how old it is. So you want to make sure that your reviews are moving through. Some of these have been there for a little too long. This one's got its reviews and everything. It needs to just basically be closed out. In this column, you've got, it's probably pretty hard to see, but the little green bits there shows a little checkbox and a number of checkboxes. This is how many ship-its are on that review. So you can, at a glance, see if somebody's got enough reviews. What it doesn't show in here, and why we've built other tools on top of this, is how many open issues there may be on that. And then this shows what repository or projects it's involved in. And then when you enter that review, you can also put in a ticket or a bug number, which allows you to, at a glance, find where's the review for a particular issue. This next screen shows some of the comments that can be made. So we've got reviews from 2 different developers. The first guy said everything looks great. He said ship it. So he essentially clicked the checkbox and said it's all good. And then this one down here shows somebody has entered an issue, and they describe what's going on, and then you see the little red circly bit. That indicates that there was a problem big enough to kind of stop the process going forward, that we need to address the issues in the code. So this one is a diff, right? You've got differences on the left. The left side is your original side, and the right side is your updated side. This is what I was saying earlier when I think that a side-by-side diff can be read easier than the top-to-bottom diff, especially if there's a lot of changes. This makes it very clear what's going on. So you've got red lines indicating that a line was completely removed, green indicating that lines were added, and then yellow indicating that there was changes. And I know it's very hard to see, and I apologize for that, but you've got, it will show you exactly what the changes are if it's a partial line or something like that as well. And so it's easy to go and glance through the code, pay attention to the green and the red and the yellow, and ignore the white code that hasn't changed at all. So this is zoomed in a bit, so it's easier to see, but you can, this is just on the right side, but you can see like this word changed. This used to be, I believe, max width on the other side, and this was some other number. But it highlights the individual characters, if it can, on what was different from that and the other. Excuse me. So when you're going through the diff, and this is review board, you can highlight a group of lines or click on a line, and you'll get a little pop-up box. Excuse me. And this pop-up box will allow you to type in the comment, and you can determine whether this is just a normal comment or if it's an issue comment. And that comment will be associated with the lines that you highlighted, which is nice. This is something that GitHub doesn't have. GitHub, again, allows you to make a diff on a single line. This allows you to highlight a group of lines and make a comment over a group. It also, because it emails, it'll email the developer, here's the issues that have been opened up. Highlighting a group of lines allows them to have some context, right? If we just highlight, flex 1, well, I don't know where that was, but if I highlight maybe a larger portion of that and I say, hey, why did you change this to flex 1 or whatever, it gives them some context so they can find it, they can think about, oh yeah, I know where that is just from looking at the email and the diff there. And gives them some better tools. And then this is the conversation, right? You've opened up some issues, and you can now allow them to make comments back. You can see the issue that was opened up has been fixed. They have another icon for if it's been dropped. And it allows you at a glance to see what's going on there. And you can write back the reason for doing something or the reason for doing something different. That's all the slides I've got. Believe it or not, we made it through 136 of them in 42 minutes. Is there any questions? Yeah.
So you mentioned that you need to add a review process to your work, but I know that a lot of companies, they don't have a review process and they don't want to do it.
Right.
How would you go about convincing someone their boss to this is worth it?
Well, I think one approach you can take is you say, look, we want high quality code, right? We don't want to continue to have to deploy to production and then go, oh no, this stuff's broken and we didn't know till we deployed it, right? We don't want to have to staff up QA to ridiculous levels to be able to catch all of these problems. And so you say, look, overall we're saving money and we're saving time. We're going to get our code in better quality up to production in a better way, and adding this in the process is going to help us do that. And so you kind of approach it that way, I think would be a good way to go. Yes? Absolutely. Yep. And implementing a code review process, if you don't have one already, it's not frictionless. There will be bumps and learning curve and everything. When we implemented it a couple years ago, it almost got to the point where I was about to cancel it. I'm like, this is all personal attacks and everything else, and it's it's tearing the team apart a bit. But you put those things in place, and you're like, look, this is about the code. Code review is about the code. No more personal attacks, no long conversations in here. Get up and go talk to the person if you've got an issue with something that they did that's, that you're feeling personally attacked or that you feel like you need to yell at them or something. Go have that conversation in person, and so we can keep the stuff that's in review board as this permanent record of all the things that have gone through and keep it positive, keep it worthwhile, positive, not attacking anybody. But there will be some bumps, there will be some learning curve if you implement this process. H? We do. We don't have that problem as much anymore, but we did have that problem before where people were like, you know what, I don't want to do this review, ship it. It takes 2 seconds to do a blind ship it, basically, not looking at the diff, not looking at the code and writing ship it. And so if we go back through and we say, okay, here's this area of code that we found this problem, right? Because eventually we've got to find the root of the problem. If we've launched a production, it's causing issues. You have to get to the root of it. You go through there and you're like, oh, you know what? I remember there was this review that was about that. And we go through and look at it and like, okay, let's talk to these people that were on this, right? Let's talk to the developer that wrote it, say, what can we do to prevent this going forward? But also talk to the reviewers and say, look, you gave this a ship it and no comments on it. And clearly you can see, that this is wrong. We've had very few cases, but we have had a couple of cases where people gave, basically blind ship it's, and there was syntax errors, right? They're just going to up and bomb, right? There's no way that should have gotten through, and so you can also automate some of that as well, and I'd recommend automating as much of that kind of thing as you can, so you never push syntax errors up. But there's very much visible problems with some of the code, and you got to say, look, you have to do this review. You have to actually take the time to do this review. That's part of our process. That's part of how we get better. It's part of how we increase quality. My personal take on the quality thing is that's my number one priority. We have to be doing good quality. Yes, we need to go fast, and yes, we need to do it cheap or whatever, but the quality's got to be there. If we don't have the quality, the other two are just going to fall off. There's a concept of the iron triangle, right? You've got good, fast, and cheap, and you can pick 2 of them, right? At most. You can't have all 3, If you say, I want this good and fast, well, you're going to have to hire really senior, really talented people to get it done, and they're not going to be cheap, right? If you want it good and cheap, well, that's the open source model, right? That's people giving their time and volunteering to do this stuff, so you're not having to pay for it, and you've got tons of eyes looking at it, so it's cheap. But you can't go and say, hey, I need this yesterday, right? They're going to laugh at you. And there's, let's see, what was the third one would be? Fast and cheap. You can get a bunch of people in there, they can knock out a whole bunch of code, and it's going to be buggy as hell, right? So you lose on one of the sides. The one that we have doesn't, but it's easy to tie into the database and look at that code. And so I've done that in some cases, like with the integrator tool that pulls in the code, I tie into the database. And so I've got views into it that the tool itself doesn't provide, at least in its UI, where I can say, okay, you type in a review number and it goes in there and pulls this code back and says, okay, here's who submitted the review, the title of it, how many reviews have been on it, how many ship-its it has, how many issues it has, and then if there are issues, are those issues closed out or dropped? So it kind of can summarize all of that. And the database is pretty easy to look at. The schema is not hard to understand at all. We're also running on a slightly older version than what's available as well. So they may have some better reporting tools or have reporting tools in there, but with an easy enough schema, you could write whatever reports you would need. All right, please do go on, joined in, and rate this talk. I would really appreciate it. It doesn't take very long, and it's good feedback for the presenters, and I would say please do that for every presenter you see at the conference. Thank you.